You are listening to the Think Brick Australia podcast. Think Brick Australia represents the clay, brick and paver manufacturers of Australia. Brick by brick, our podcast will discuss technical information and architectural case studies with special guests. I'm your host, Elizabeth McIntyre, the CEO of Think Brick Australia. On today's podcast, we are going to be talking about lintels and shelf angle detailing. And I'd like to welcome Rahul Elangovan to the podcast to help us go through some of these important facts. Welcome, Rahul.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thanks for having me.
Now, a lot of people may have heard what lintels are, but let's really define exactly what is a lintel.
Well, to define a lintel, let's just go all the way back with just general building construction.
Okay.
So with buildings, there's windows, there's doors, and what they do is they present a weakness in the walling system, right? They're basically a hole in the wall. So to help support that hole, we provide these things called lintels. So lintels, they could be made out of steel, concrete, reinforced masonry, all sorts of materials, just to ensure that that section where there's a weakness in the wall can be properly reinforced.
So we can continue to build in brick or masonry above the door. Yeah. Excellent. All right. And just what are sort of some of the, when you talk about the lintel going across, say, for example, a doorway, how far does that lintel extend?
Yeah, so when you're designing with lintels, you'd have to use obviously your masonry construction standards, so your AS 3700 or your AS 4773, which you mentioned a ton of times in this podcast.
Yes.
And within those manuals, you will find that for certain opening spaces, you would need to have your lintels embedded either side of your opening at a certain distance.
Okay.
So for example, if you had an opening of 1 meter or greater, you would have to have your lintel embedded at least 150 millimeters either side of your opening.
Right. Okay. That makes a good lot of sense. And we will ensure in our show notes that we've got all of those references to the standards there.
Yep.
What is a shelf angle?
So how a shelf angle differs from a lintel is that a shelf angle is actually mechanically fastened to a supporting structure.
Okay.
So with lintels, they're essentially self-supporting.
Right.
As in how I mentioned before, they're embedded either side of the opening.
And the builder or the bricklayer can actually just put them in.
Yeah, just put them in on top of an opening.
Okay.
And it's basically secure.
Right.
But with a shelf angle, they're used for more heavy load-bearing applications.
Okay.
So for example, say you have a residential building.
Yep.
At each floor, you would generally have a shelf angle to support your masonry.
Okay.
Because you can't just have a 10-meter high wall of masonry, right? It needs to be supported at regular intervals.
Okay, so that sort of makes sense. And I know we've got pictures in front of us, but if you can just describe how does the mortar sort of feature in these wall angles?
Yeah, so what's important with your lintels and shelf angles is that you want to ensure your bricks are properly adhered to the actual lintels, right?
Yeah.
So
they're stuck.
Yeah, exactly. So during construction, you'd have your lintel, then you'd have your bed of mortar, you'd place the brick. And additionally, what you would do is any space between your lintel and your actual brick, so the horizontal or vertical leg of it, would actually have some mortar behind it.
Yep.
So we call that mortar packing.
Yep.
And what that does, that prevents rotational movement in the brickwork.
Yeah,
it just keeps it solid.
It keeps everything solid and sandwiched in, so to speak. Okay. All right. Now, just in terms of, I guess, when we look at the construction requirements and we talk about strength and stiffness, what sort of data must be known before you can determine this for a lintel?
Yeah, great question. So with lintels and shelf angles, their actual detailing for it and the way manufacturers produce them is actually prescribed in AS 2699.3.
AS 2699.3, everyone. Don't commit it to memory. We've got a reference for you.
Not 0.1, not 0.2, it's 0.3.
0.3.
Yeah. So within there, they would outline your durability requirements for different locations that your lintel is located within your building. So for example, there's different durability classes from R1 to R5, with R5 being the class where your lintel is most exposed to exterior weather conditions.
So at the beach or something like that, coastal areas.
Coastal areas.
Okay.
And whereas R1, your lintel is like enclosed within your building and is secure away from potential corrosion.
Right. And because that's what we're worried about, given that a lot of these are steel, is corrosion. Okay. Yeah. Any other things that we need to think of outside of that?
Yeah, so I guess relating to it kind of. So each of the durability classes would require different coatings on your lintels. And I guess with lintels in general, fun fact, all lintels have to have special markings on them.
I did not know this.
So each lintel has to have the actual standard it's built towards.
Okay.
So it has to have AS 2699.3 written onto it.
Right.
Then it also has to have its manufacturer's name. And then it also has to have the durability class at which it's used for.
Right. So you can't really go wrong once you have the data and then you pick out your lintel. You should be matching perfectly to where it's meant to be.
Yeah.
Okay. And then what sort of happens with shelf angles then?
Shelf angles are essentially designed the exact same way. So shelf angles and lintels, almost identical in its purpose. It's just with shelf angles, like I mentioned before, just mechanically fastened into a structural backing.
Okay. And one of the examples we had in one of our award entries was with Otago Bay. And again, we can see it in front of us and we'll put it in the show notes. But what did they kind of do there that was a little bit different?
Yeah, so with Otago Bay, they use lintels in this really cool way. So it's what we've called soffits, which you've also mentioned previously. So that's where we have your bricks essentially used as a ceiling. And obviously bricks are heavy and they need to be fastened onto something. So what they did, they had lintels and then they have bricks essentially which are adhered to these lintels, I guess upside down, acting as a roofing system.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, it's kind of cool.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Well, let me see if I can do a quick recap of what we've discussed. I've really liked talking about lintels today and shelf angles. Firstly, the lintel is a load-bearing beam above, normally a window or a door, any opening. And depending on whether this is just for a single house, a double story or a commercial building, that will determine the data that we need to make sure that this lintel is prescribed for that particular load requirement.
Yeah, exactly. It depends on how much brickwork the lintel is actually carrying.
Yep.
And depending on that, you'll need different strength lintels.
There you go. And the shelf angle is a more structured angle which is fixed to a supporting wall to support the vertical masonry veneer as well.
Yeah, exactly like that. You'd find them at your floors on residential buildings, multi-story residential buildings to support your brickwork at each level.
And a couple of things I've got to check for with regards to lintels and shelf angles are obviously that they're manufactured to
AS 2699.3.
Excellent. And that should be on the lintel, and that you're also making sure that for the particular lintel that you are using, that is for the correct area that you are constructing in.
Yes, you got to make sure it adheres to its durability class requirements.
And finally, what we've seen is some really different ways that architects have used lintels and shelf angles in some beautiful masonry work that is featured not only in our awards, but will be in these show notes.
Yeah, we have a great case study that we could link.
Rahul, thank you so much for this information today. Even for me, being in the industry for all these years, I did not know some of those details about lintels, and maybe I should have. As you know, we've got everything in front of us here, and I always love to do something else whilst I'm listening to podcasts. Where can we go for more information on lintels?
So for more information on lintels, you could always firstly check out the standards, but then you could also check our resources at thinkbrick.com.au.
Perfect. Thank you for thinking lintels and shelf angles. And when you're thinking brick, make sure you don't forget those two. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please follow, rate, and review our podcast. We are always looking for new ways to think brick. If you have an idea of what you'd like to hear about, there's a link in our show notes to let us know.